Wonderful. Well, I must say it's a fantastic pleasure to be here. It's also slightly daunting because I'm neither a lawyer or an environmental lawyer, nor am I a natural scientist. And we have here in this room people with tremendous expertise from both sides, people who've been involved in developing and shaping the planetary boundaries concept, and now who are bringing the very powerful tools of law and legal approaches internationally and nationally to bear and thinking about how we meet the challenges. What I hope, though, I might be able to do in kicking off this event is to slightly broaden our perspective a bit and say and offer some thoughts about science and governance and how we might want to think about and open up the debate a little bit about how the nature of the governance challenges and how they might be relating to science as we move forward. And my contention is that we're, yes, at a moment, a constitutional moment, of enormous challenge, but also of opportunities. And some of those opportunities lie in new kinds of fora that are trying to bring scientists together with stakeholders around the world to think about things in new ways. So this talk partly draws on my relatively new position as Vice Chair of Future Earth. And I'll be coming to that in the latter half of the talk and talking a bit about where I think Future Earth kinds of work are different and might contribute. So I don't need to rehash the planetary boundaries concept for this audience. Suffice to say that we're in a situation now where science, particularly Earth system science, has proposed with unprecedented and mounting evidence that there is a critical set of Earth system processes which together have been maintaining the planet in Holocene-like conditions. And this gives us a safe operating space for humanity. And identifying these processes and the boundaries and thresholds at work are ongoing tasks for science, around which there's mounting evidence and a certain amount of contestation and controversy. But all of that, in a sense, I'm taking for granted as a scientific starting point for this talk. Why does it matter? Well, clearly it matters for us all if we're in a situation where humanity is transgressing, as scientific understandings are suggesting we are, key planetary boundaries around climate change, around biodiversity, around nitrogen cycles, and threatening others. But I would suggest that it also matters very, very much for people who are already living in poverty and for the justice and equality agendas that those bring to bear. So, mediated by political processes, institutions, economies, we're seeing a range of scarcities, of challenges, of deprivations kicking in around the world, manifested in all kinds of scarcities and crises and forms of poverty, intensifying conditions for people who are often already fairly marginalised. And that's where I come to these debates, from my work as director of the STEPS Centre, which is a group of largely social scientists working across interdisciplinary boundaries, but with very much a normative agenda that says sustainability is about justice, and we have to take into account the perspectives and priorities of the very poorest in that context. So I'll make that clear from the outset. So how do we think about connecting up poverty and justice agendas, human rights agendas, with planetary boundaries frameworks? There are a number of different frameworks and approaches on offer. One, I think very useful one, comes from Kate Rayworth, who is here today, and her work around the donut, which has suggested that the challenge isn't just about steering within planetary boundaries, within this safe operating space for humanity. It's also about a safe and just space which respects people's human rights and dignity and voice around material issues, but also around those less tangible questions, around freedom from violence, around social equity, around gender equality. And Kate's work has very powerfully conceived of these things as social foundations, really raising a challenge, I suppose, for those thinking about governance and legal approaches as to how we steer within a just space as well as a safe one. Others, of course, think about these challenges in terms of concepts of sustainability, We've had some recent reworkings of the original 3 pillars in pieces by Dave Griggs et al. In Nature, which say more than ever we need to be thinking about environment and economy and the social dimensions of sustainability. Perhaps with environment sitting there on top as boundaries that mustn't be transgressed, but nevertheless requiring an integrated approach. Or we have the kind of definition that the Future Earth programme is working with, which says sustainability has to be about combining ecological integrity with social equality and human well-being and security. And there's a new sense of urgency and pressure, I think, around taking forward these kinds of challenges in what many are identifying and debating as a potentially new era, a new geological era of the Anthropocene. In the STEP Centre, we've been working to connect up ideas around planetary boundaries, social boundaries, with the notion of pathways, arguing that actually there are opportunities to move towards these goals of ecological integrity, social equity, and human well-being. But that involves steering pathways, trajectories of interacting social, technological, ecological, institutional processes so that they deliver inclusive and sustainable development. And this is a little diagram that came from some work I did with Kate, actually, quite recently, which puts the idea of pathways into the kind of donut framework to suggest that, okay, we might sometimes be looking at unsafe pathways, which are steering us away from any kind of safe space. Maybe we're looking at fossil-fueled energy trajectories. But equally, we might be looking at pathways which are heading us below those social foundations. An example might be entirely commercially focused land investments that could be good in terms of ecological integrity, but are actually undermining rights to food. Pathways can play out at different scales, in different ways and in different places. And one of the arguments we've been making in the STEP Centre is that even within a safe and just space, we've got a lot of alternatives afoot, and we need to be aware of them. Take a challenge like trying to steer within meeting the challenge of sustainable food security amidst growing populations and climate change. All sorts of different ways of approaching that, involving different kinds of technologies, from GM through to farmer participatory plant breeding, involving different institutional and tenure arrangements around land tenure, around labour. The point is that these alternative pathways have very different implications for some other questions which relate to justice. And we've sometimes used a kind of heuristic of 3Ds to ask questions about pathways. We need to ask what directions they're headed in. Are they steering us outside boundaries, or are they within it? What is driving that steering? And therefore, how might we think about re-steering pathways? But we also need to ask whether there is enough diversity in our approaches. Are they diverse enough to resist the temptation to pursue a single motorway, and actually to respect the variety of contexts, values, goals that different people, different places, whether it's regions, countries, localities, might want to pursue, and actually to keep our options open in the face of a world that is inherently uncertain. And then the third D that we often talk about is about distribution, and this is where justice kicks in. For any pathway, there will be trade-offs between scales, between social groups. And we need to make those, I think, quite explicit in thinking about choices, how those are going to affect inequalities of wealth, of power, of resource use, and opportunity. So contestation and trade-off is, I think, part of the field, part of the set of challenges that we're very much engaged with. So that leads me to ask, drawing on a wide variety of perspectives on governance, coming from social science, political science, people engaged in action and practice. If we're talking about steering pathways to sustainability, what kind of governance do we need? A number of different kind of principles and precepts have emerged from recent literature, and there are quite a lot of them. There are suggestions that we need to be thinking about multi-scale approaches. Polycentric is the term that's often used because challenges do exist across global and national and local scales. We also need our governance approaches and our institutions to be adaptive, because things don't unfold in linear manners. We've got complex feedbacks, we've got uncertainties, and we need to have institutions that are flexible enough to respond and adapt and shift course a bit if necessary. But we also need approaches that allow deliberation, because different people and groups and scales involve different goals and desired futures. And we need, I think, to be able to keep our openness to debates and policy wide enough to allow that deliberation to happen in an inclusive manner. We then probably need approaches that are networked, that are going to combine actors in the state, in business, in NGOs, in civil society, and which bring together people who are working within legal frameworks and perspectives and outside them, combining the top-down with the bottom-up and with what social movements and the alliances they may form can bring to bear. And finally, but really rather critically and throughout, I think we need governance approaches that are deeply integrated with science and knowledge. That's to help us clarify boundaries, but also the processes, the actors who are involved in shaping current pathways, and therefore who might be involved in re-steering those in the directions they might need to go in. So my suggestion here is that legal perspectives and approaches and frameworks are critical, but they can't do it alone. So I now want to move on to think a little bit about the role of science. Now, one way of approaching the scientific challenge here, and one framing, I think, of this meeting is to say that science, and a particular kind of science, has, as it were, delivered us evidence in the form of planetary boundaries, which says now there's a governance challenge, a legal set of challenges to which we must respond. I want to suggest something slightly different, that there are actually roles now for scientists and people interested in governance to work in far more integrated ways across the board. And this is the kind of argument that I think Future Earth is trying to make, and the sorts of opportunities that are being opened up by this new 10-year programme that was launched at Rio last year, in parallel to initiatives like the Planetary Boundaries Initiative, have enabled, and the conversations that are now beginning. So Future Earth, as many of you may know, I think is best described as a global platform, a new global platform for collaboration in research on global environmental change and sustainability. But there are some things that are trying to be rather different about it. That this is research that's integrated, trying to be integrated across disciplines, so bringing social scientists, political scientists, legal scholars potentially together with natural scientists. But also that is integrated in its relationship with stakeholders, with activists, with governments, with businesses, with lawyers, through processes of co-design and co-production. And that is the recipe that Future Earth is seeing as necessary for a solutions-oriented perspective and for the kind of transformation that I think we all need. So there's a historical context, which many of you may know about. We've had global environmental change science going back over several decades, which has now came together in the Earth System Science Partnership in the early 2000s, and then is being kind of reworked and drawing on its excellence, but trying to adapt the existing programs to work in slightly new ways under a Future Earth umbrella, really right now. And the co-design element is, I think, one of the biggest challenges, but one of the biggest opportunities. This means moving beyond a kind of linear model where scientists provide their evidence and then present this as the truth to which policymakers, lawyers should then respond. It's actually saying that scientists and other stakeholders should be working together, both to design problems, to frame them, what is the nature of the problem, then to design the kinds of research and knowledge production that's needed to take those forward, and then to actually work together in doing it. So this is just one representation of the way that those more academic and stakeholder involvements might relate to each other. But I think the key thing is that they're working in tandem and in an integrated manner from the very beginning. The research themes of Future Earth, of which there are 3, I think all have quite strong implications for how this kind of integrated agenda moves forwards, and actually for the role of law and legal and governance perspectives in them. So Dynamic Planet is, one could see at one level, as it were, this is where the hard science kicks in. This is what's telling us about states and trends and modelling potential boundaries and threshold effects. But I think we could also suggest that there's actually a rather key role for legal perspectives, understandings of governance and politics in seeing where the drivers are coming from. I suppose in that little phrase here, societal system, that's also about what existing laws and frameworks and policies are or are not delivering in terms of contributing to the dynamics that we're seeing at the moment. The second theme is called global development, and here we're talking about the real challenges of stewardship, of ecosystem services, and of justice and access. And again, of course, many, many roles for legal perspectives, both in thinking about existing patterns of stewardship and how those might be changed, and very much coming in on arguments about justice and how it might be achieved. And then there's this third theme, termed transformations towards sustainability, which is the sort of obvious place where a meeting like this might be saying, okay, this is where we need new governance frameworks. And they're absolutely there around recognising the roles of international law, but also regional and national frameworks and incentives. But my suggestion would be that actually the role of law and thinking about legal approaches within governance are there across all of these Future Earth themes, and that actually scientists and people interested in governance should be working together throughout them. And indeed, as Future Earth moves forwards, many of the projects and activities are going to be sitting absolutely across those themes. They will be bringing them together. And indeed, although at the moment there's a kind of structural divide between the Science Committee and the Engagement Committee, which is where many stakeholders will sit, that's a legacy of the way Future Earth was designed in its transition process. We're thinking hard about ways to make sure that those committees are absolutely working together from the very beginning, not in a separated way. So this is just the alliance of funders that's behind Future Earth. And a quick update on the current status. There's an interim secretariat which has at its leadership Franz Berkhout, who is an extremely experienced scholar and practitioner at science policy interfaces. So I think we've got a real opportunity there to take forward these kinds of integrated perspectives. And as the Science Committee working with the Secretariat, we're doing a number of things at the moment. A key one is to bring these global environmental change programs into Future Earth in a way that builds on scientific excellence, but encourages new ways of working. And then launch a range of new projects and initiatives which will focus on these thoroughly integrated ways of working. So my conclusion really, and I suppose my own take as co-chair of the Science Committee, part of what I would like to be doing over the next decade, is to recognise very strongly that sustainability is political, and that concerns with power and politics and the roles of action at constitutional and scientific moments should be deeply concerned with power and politics, and that these things need to be at the heart of Future Earth. And that ideas and perspectives and approaches around governance, including but going beyond the legal and what legal frameworks have to offer, are critical things that we should be integrating, and that scientists and people from other perspectives need to be working together in taking forward this opportunity I think we've now got for joint thinking and action in a scientific moment as well as perhaps a constitutional one. So I suppose my parting shot would be, please join the debate. It would be really nice to see initiatives like the Planetary Boundaries initiatives and the kind of expertise around this table integrated very solidly with the kinds of activities now moving forward under Future Earth. And there are all sorts of ways to do it. And I hope this meeting can be a good start to that. Thank you.